Welcome back to Biology 2210 at CNM. We are discussing the nervous system, chapter 12 in your textbooks, and we left off last time at objective number 82. So we have finished our discussion of types of neurons and structures of neurons, and we are now ready to begin section 4 in the chapter, which is electrophysiology. And in this section, we are going to seek to understand action potentials at a deeper level than what we already know. We already know something about action potentials from our discussion of muscle cell activity. So we're just going to add to that. So much of this section will be review, hopefully, but hopefully will provide a little bit more depth regarding action potentials. So once again, we begin with the concept of electric potential. This is something we've previously described. Remember, potential is a kind of, electric potential is a kind of positional or potential energy. It represents stored energy due to a separation of charged particles, or in other words, a difference in the concentration of charged particles between 2 points. The best, most familiar example, again, of electric potential would be a 9-volt battery, or really any battery. But 9-volt batteries are the easiest ones to visualize because you clearly can see in that rectangular battery shape, you can clearly see that you have, and I apologize for my bad drawing, but you've got your 9-volt battery. I know it looks like a Coke glass, with basically two terminals, right? And one is labeled positive and one is labeled negative. And that's because inside the battery there's actually two chambers, one of which contains positive charge relative to the other side, which is negative charge. And so that charge separation, or in other words, difference in concentration of charged particles from one place to another, represents electric potential. And so this battery has electrical potential. Living cells, of course, can do the same thing. Living cells, of course, have membranes, cell membranes that surround them. And for reasons we'll discuss shortly, the inside of a cell tends to be more negative relative to the outside of a cell. And so living cells also have electric potential. The magnitude of electrical potential is measured in a unit called volts. And so in this particular battery, if I was to connect a voltmeter or some kind of measuring device to the two terminals, I could measure how much charge separation that would be. And of course the dial would read 9 volts. That's why it's called a 9-volt battery. If I was to do a similar setup with a microscopically small set of leads, measuring the inside and the outside of a cell, what I would find is that I would not find a volt's worth of difference. I would find what are called millivolts worth of difference. A millivolt, remember, is 1,000th of a volt. So living cells do have this charge separation. They do exhibit this electrical potential between the inside and outside, but it's very small relative to the voltages that we associate with things like batteries, or certainly much smaller than things like house current, house voltage, for instance. All right, so we understand what the concept of electric potential is, and again, it represents potential energy. And remember, potential energy is energy that, due to its position, is capable of being converted to some kind of kinetic energy, or energy that is stored and can be used to do work. And so what happens, again, generally speaking, is when I connect a device, an appliance, say, to the two leads of the battery. If this wasn't a meter, instead if this was something like a light bulb, I would get electrical flow, because we know that opposite charges attract. So if I do something to connect these two sides of a battery, I'm going to get a flow of electrical charge, and that's what we refer to as electrical current. It's the flow of electrical charged particles, and realize because this is movement, because this is flow, we're converting potential energy into now kinetic energy. And kinetic energy, of course, can be used to do work. In the case of the battery, the flow of the charges is going to flow through the light bulb, which is designed to use the flow of those charged particles to generate light. In the cell, we can do a similar thing. We can allow charges to flow either into or out of the cell through the membrane, and that flow of charges once again can be used to do work. In this case, the work that's going to be done will not be to light a light bulb, of course, but instead the work that's done by allowing ions to flow will be the work of creating an impulse or creating a signal. And that signal is, of course, is what we're going to call an action potential, and the action potential is the signal that we use to transmit messages around the nervous system. Flow, by the way, is measured in units called amperes, or just amps. And so voltage is measuring the degree of charge separation, and then current is measured in amps. And once again, the currents that we're going to experience are going to be in milliamps, not amps, because of the very small voltage associated with living cells. Now, just like we have switches in electrical devices that can control the current, turn it on and off, we also have control over the flow or the current in our cells. And to control that current, those charges, we use what are called gated channels. Remember, gated channels are proteins that are embedded in our cell membranes that can open or close depending on certain stimuli. We have a variety of different types of gated channels in our cells that open and close in response to environmental changes. The two most important ones that we have relative to neurons and action potentials are chemically gated channels, which will open and or close in response to various chemical signals. And remember, the other kind is the voltage-gated channel, which opens and closes in response to changes in voltage or changes in the electrical potential of the cell. And so these gated channels that open and close are very specific to very specific ions. And so this gives our cells some control over which ions will flow, when they will flow, and this gives us the ability to turn specific currents on and then off. So at rest, as we might remember from the last chapter, at rest, typical cells have what is referred to as a resting membrane potential, meaning when the cell, not when the cell is active, but just under normal resting conditions, there is going to always be a typical charge separation across the membrane. Again, that makes the interior negative relative to the exterior. This baseline electric potential across the cell membrane is referred to as the resting membrane potential. And again, it's not due to an imbalance of electrons. It's due to an imbalance in electrolyte distribution. Remember, electrolytes are basically ions. Sodium ions, potassium ions, calcium ions, magnesium ions, chloride ions. We have a whole slew of electrolytes dissolved in our fluids, both the cytoplasm inside the cell and the interstitial fluid or extracellular fluid outside the cell. And an imbalance in these charged particles, these ions, is what creates the resting membrane potential. Now, there are three main factors that affect the resting or generate the resting membrane potential in a typical cell. The first is that ions diffuse down their concentration gradient through the membrane. So we're assuming that there are passive channels for these ions as well as gated channels. And so, of course, ions are going to diffuse through passive channels down their concentration gradients through the membrane. Now, that in and of itself doesn't create an imbalance because, as we know, diffusion always results in equilibrium, which is often a equal concentration of a material on two sides of a permeable barrier. But what happens is that ions not only diffuse down their concentration gradient, they also diffuse along an electrical gradient as well. So in introductory biology, we talk about how diffusion really always occurs from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration. Well, that's true for neutral particles, but for electrically charged particles, it is theoretically possible for materials to diffuse from regions of low concentration to high concentration. That would happen if an electrical gradient was powerful enough to overcome the concentration gradient. Because remember, as we've already stated, oppositely charged particles attract each other. And of course, the flip side of that is that similarly charged particles repel each other. And so I might have, say, a concentration gradient for sodium that will cause it to want to diffuse in one direction, say from left to right across a barrier. But if that diffusion, if there's also an electrical gradient, then sodium might diffuse in the opposite direction. And perhaps this is best seen by looking at a simple diagram, which I can draw here. And so we have a permeable barrier, and we have sodium ions on one side of the barrier, and we have sodium ions on the other side of the barrier. And let's presume, as I said, that we have a higher concentration. These little brackets are a shorthand way of indicating concentration of any substance that's within the brackets. And so let's say we have a higher concentration here and a lower concentration on this side. And I know that's hard to read, but you get the idea. So normally, if we were just thinking about biology, 2210, introductory biology, you would predict that diffusion of the sodium would clearly take place from high concentration to low concentration. And again, that's reasonable to presume. But what if I add an electrical gradient to this situation? And what if I was to tell you, because of what's going on with some other ions or some other conditions, that this side of the barrier was extremely positive, very positively charged, and this side of the barrier was very negatively charged. Well, again, what we didn't talk about in intro bio is that electrical charge will also affect diffusion, because even though sodium wants to diffuse along its concentration gradient to the right side in this scenario, all this positive charge is going to repel those positively charged sodium ions and going to represent a force resisting sodium's diffusion. At the same time, all this negative charge on this side is going to be very attractive to those sodium ions and not want to let them diffuse away into across the barrier to the other side. So the electrical gradient, forgetting concentration gradients for the moment, the electrical gradient is clearly going to repel the sodium ions on the right side and push sodium this direction. And so what we see is when trying to figure out which way a charged particle is going to diffuse, we can't just consider concentration alone. We have to look at both the concentration gradient and the electrical gradient that exists. And this is what we refer to in Objective 90 as the the electrochemical gradient that the ions are experiencing. And so essentially what happens is, depending on which of these arrows is bigger, that will determine which way, in this case, sodium will diffuse. So in this case, if the electrical gradient was much more powerful, much larger in magnitude than the concentration gradient, we're going to get overall net diffusion of sodium from the right side to the left side, rather than left to right. And as I said earlier, that would be a diffusion of sodium from lower concentration to higher concentration. Okay, so that's a little twist that we have to add. And so what we see then is that the end result would not be equal concentrations of sodium, the end result would be an imbalance in sodium ions. And this can happen for each ion. We're just using sodium, but remember there are many electrolytes that are diffusing across cell membranes. And so this diffusion, really, it should say along their electrochemical gradient, is what can cause ions to become imbalanced. The other thing to consider in all this is that the plasma membrane, the cell membrane, is not equally permeable to all ions. The plasma membrane is more permeable to some ions than to others. And so we're not going to be able to get a nice flow of ions balancing each other out electrically, because the membrane is more permeable to certain positive ones, perhaps less permeable to other negative ones. That's going to contribute to an imbalance, an electrical imbalance across the membrane. And so we have all these factors that are contributing to the generation of the membrane potential. And there's one other factor that's extremely important in contributing to the resting membrane potential, and we're going to see that in the next slide. And that is the sodium-potassium pump. The sodium-potassium pump, run ahead to this. The sodium-potassium pump, remember, is constantly active in all cells. It's continuously working to compensate for the fact that sodium and potassium are constantly leaking through their passive channels. Because one of the most important gradients we must have inside our cells, besides the membrane potential, is we must have an appropriate concentration gradient for sodium and potassium. And if we let them just leak through their channels, we will lose that appropriate concentration gradient. And so the cells are constantly performing the sodium-potassium pump. First thing to appreciate about the sodium-potassium pump is that it requires ATP. It is an active transport pump, and that's why it's going to generate concentration gradients. Remember, active transport generally works against the normal direction of diffusion, and so it takes energy to fight that natural flow. And it takes 1 ATP of energy for the sodium-potassium pump to pump essentially one time. It's sodium and potassium. The sodium-potassium pump is also an antiport type pump. Remember, an antiport is a kind of molecule, a kind of protein that pumps two different substances in opposite directions of one another. So it's a symport in that it's transporting two molecules at once, or two, in this case, ions at once. But it's a type of symport called an antiport because it's pumping the ions in opposite directions. Specifically, the sodium-potassium pump is pumping sodium out of the cell, and it is pumping potassium into the cell. And it's important to remember that the sodium-potassium pump constantly expending energy to pump sodium out of the cell and potassium into the cell. So this is going to create a concentration gradient for both these ions. This means that sodium is always going to be at higher concentrations outside of a cell, and potassium is always going to be at a higher concentration inside a cell. Okay? And then a final thing to recognize about the sodium-potassium pump is that it is an antiport, but it's not a balanced antiport. In other words, the number of sodium and potassium ions that it transports is not equal. For every 3 sodiums that are pumped out of a cell, the sodium-potassium pump only pumps 2 potassium ions back in. So it's a 3 for 2 exchange, and again, this exchange 3 for 2 is what burns 1 ATP of energy. Well, if you think about it, of course, that, again, as we said, creates concentration gradients for these two ions, but it also creates an electrical imbalance. If every time the sodium-potassium pump performs an exchange, if we lose 3 positive charges from the cell interior, but only replace that with 2 positive charges, that is going to result in the interior of the cell becoming more negative, or in other words, less positive, because I'm not replacing every positive sodium with a positive potassium. Overall, that imbalance in the sodium-potassium pump contributes about 3 millivolts worth of the resting membrane potentials, minus 70 millivolts. So it does contribute, probably more importantly than its contribution to the overall value is because of the constant action of the sodium-potassium pump, it's very important in maintaining the membrane potential at minus 70 and keeping it from drifting one way or the other. All right, so a highly energetic process because every cell has thousands of sodium-potassium pumps constantly working. As you can see, 70% of the energy of the nervous system is really due to the sodium-potassium pumps constantly working away. And it really is the majority of the energy used by the body in general. It's a major component of what we call our basal metabolic rate. So discounting the massive energy used by exercising muscles, the sodium-potassium pump really constitutes a huge portion of our basal metabolic rates and the rate at which we burn energy and calories. All right, so here we see a picture again of the factors that contribute to the membrane potential. Here we just see passive leakage channels for sodium and potassium. And again, sodium-potassium pump, of course, compensates for that leakage. All right, so what kind of changes can we expect to see in this membrane potential? Well, changes in, first of all, the first thing to appreciate is that changes in membrane potential, any deviation from minus 70, can be used or is used by neurons as a signal. Any change in the membrane potential can be used by neurons as a signal. And these are referred to, by the way, as local potentials. Local potentials are changes, usually small initially, changes in membrane potential that neurons can use as signals. Now, what can cause these local potentials? It really depends on the kind of neuron that you're dealing with. There are different kinds of neurons that will respond or create local potentials in response to different kinds of stimuli. So some neurons will create local potentials, again, localized changes in membrane potential in response to chemicals. We call those, for instance, chemoreceptors. Some respond to light energy. Those would be the kind that you find, say, in the retina. Some respond to heat, thermoreceptors. Some respond to various mechanical disturbances, meaning touch, just a simple touch or pressure. Some respond to stretch. Neurons located in the sensory neurons located in the walls of blood vessels can sense the stretch in the wall of the blood vessel, and that's a main mechanism whereby we monitor blood pressure, for instance. So we have a variety of different kinds of neurons that each have their own what we call modality, meaning they each have their own specific kind of environmental signal that will stimulate them to create a local potential. So generally speaking, what happens is we're going to expose a neuron to a stimulus, and it's often the dendrites, remember, of the neuron that are going to pick up messages and carry them toward the cell body. And so sometimes it can be the cell body itself, but for most purposes it's going to be dendrites. So let's presume that we've got a dendrite that's been stimulated by some stimulus that it's designed to respond to. Essentially, the sequence of events that follows is essentially the opening of sodium gates initially. And of course, if we open sodium gated channels, which way is sodium going to flow? It is going to flow into the cell, because remember we just described that due to the sodium potassium pump, sodium always has a higher concentration outside of the cell. So the initial event that occurs in a local potential is the entry of these sodium ions, which are positive. That makes, at a very localized patch of membrane, that makes the cell interior less negative. Makes the cell interior less negative. This is referred to as a depolarization. Recall, this is referred to as a depolarization. Now, why is making the inside referred to as a depolarization? You may remember some time ago, when we were again talking about muscles, I was talking about what polarity means in general. Polarity means that you can identify two opposite regions of something. Like the Earth is polar. It's not electrically polar, but it's magnetically polar in that it has a North Pole and a South Pole, and these are oppositely, these are opposite magnetic conditions at opposite ends of the planet. And so whenever you can identify two opposite ends of something, it's a polar structure. We've talked about electrical polarity in here, again in intro bio, we talked about polar molecules. Molecules where the sharing of electrons is unequal, so that some parts of the molecule become more positively charged, some parts become more negatively charged, and so you have literally a molecule with electrical poles. I think water is probably the best example of what we describe as a polar molecule. Well, if you think about it, a membrane that has resting membrane potential is also a polar entity in the sense that the inside of the cell is negative and the outside of the membrane is positive. And so that, again, that difference represents electrical polarity. So when a cell is at rest, at resting membrane potential, we are in a polarized state, a negative interior and a positive exterior. As sodium enters the cell during one of these local potentials, that is going to cause the inside of the cell to become more positive as sodium enters. And so if I was tracing this graphically, I would see an upward deflection in the graph here as the interior becomes less negative. Well, notice what that does is it brings the membrane potential closer to 0. 0 would mean an equal charge separation across the membrane, and 0 would be most definitely a nonpolar condition. Right? A cell with a membrane potential of 0 would have a 0 polarity, electrical polarity across the membrane. So if I take the cell membrane from -70 and start bringing it towards 0, I am depolarizing the membrane. I am making it less polar as it goes from -70 to -60 to -50, -40. In other words, as it approaches 0, it is becoming less polar, and so we call that a depolarization. Now, if I was to pass 0, if I was to depolarize it all the way to 0, that would of course complete depolarization. If I was to continue this flow of sodium, I might get so much sodium to flow in that I'd go past 0 and end up on maybe the positive side of polarity. Technically, this isn't depolarization anymore, right? Now I'm polarizing the membrane again. I'm just polarizing it in the opposite direction, making the interior more positive. Some people distinguish this and call it reverse polarization, but most intro books don't bother with that detail, and they simply call any upward movement, whether it is towards 0 or even goes past 0, they will call the whole thing a depolarization. So, and that we'll follow that convention, even though we're recognizing here that it's technically incorrect. We're always going to call upward deflections depolarizations, even though we know this upper part of it here technically is a reverse polarization, not technically a depolarization. But at any rate, as long as we understand why we're calling it depolarization. Now, what happens is during this depolarization, again, this is a very local event where we have little gated channels for sodium that are opening up, and the sodium that's on the outside of the cell This is outside the cell, and this is inside the cell. And this, of course, represents the cell membrane. As sodium flows through and into the cell, it doesn't just cause depolarization at this local level here, but remember what happens is as these sodium ions enter, they will start to diffuse in all directions because particles always diffuse along their electrochemical gradient. In this case, there's really just a concentration gradient. And so all these sodiums that get injected during this local potential, which by the way is also referred to as a graded potential, and I've used that term before as well, and I prefer graded potential to local potential. All this sodium that flows in during this local or graded potential has to flow somewhere. Some of it flows in this direction, and depending on how long the cell is, of course it's going to keep diffusing. And so this creates a current. This creates a current of sodium positively charged ions within the cell, just underneath the cell membrane. All right, and as you might guess, as this sodium spreads, it's also going to cause depolarization of the membrane that it's passing by. So these pieces of membrane are not going to remain at -70. As the sodium flows under them, that positive charge, I don't know, might take it to -50. And then in this patch, it might take it to -40. And then in this patch, it might take it to -30, and so on. I'm sorry, I apologize for that. -60, excuse me, and minus, say, 65 or so on. Okay? Now, why did I have to fix that? What's the point I'm trying to make here? The point I'm trying to make with these numbers is to appreciate that my initial depolarization that occurs with a graded potential, as the sodium ions spread away, as the current flows, the depolarization gets weaker as it spreads away from that point at which it originated. Why does it get weaker? Well, first of all, why does this represent it getting weaker? Because notice the degree of depolarization is lessening. I'm getting closer and closer back to -70, which is just plain old resting. So the degree of depolarization is diminishing as I spread away from this point at which the graded potential occurred. So now the question is, why does it diminish? Why does it get less as we spread away from it? Well, what happens to this sodium as it spreads in all directions? It starts as a very concentrated region of sodium ions, but as they diffuse and spread, of course, they become less and less concentrated. So the farther away I am from this point at which the graded potential occurred, the less and less concentrated the sodium becomes as it spreads out in all directions. And so that's why the degree of depolarization tends to diminish as it travels along the neuron. Now, eventually, if we're going to get a true or real action potential, remember you need voltage-gated channels. You need a voltage-gated channel to experience an action potential. I'm just going to abbreviate it as voltage channel here because my writing is so terrible with this. So at some point in the cell, there are going to exist voltage-gated channels. And sooner or later, the signal might spread far enough to reach a voltage-gated channel. Remember, where are these voltage-gated channels going to be located? Well, they're going to be located in the cell's trigger zone. So we're trying to get this signal that originated possibly in the dendrites. We're hoping that it's strong enough so that as it spreads and weakens, that by the time it reaches the trigger zone where the voltage channels are, it might still be strong enough to trigger an opening of the voltage channel. And then something novel, something different is going to happen. Okay, but the goal and the function really of graded potentials when they occur, usually in dendrites, is to create this current this current that decreases in strength, this wave of depolarization that decreases in strength as it spreads, trying to get that to be strong enough so then when it reaches the trigger zone, it can stimulate voltage-gated channels. And again, remember, where is the cell's trigger zone? The cell's trigger zone is essentially the region around the axon hillock, the very beginning of the axon. Okay, so that's a summary of what we need to happen. We're going to take a look at that now in step by step as we go through the next few slides. So again, remember, local potentials are different from action potentials in a variety of ways. They are graded potentials, and I like to call them graded potentials. The book here simply says that being graded is a property of a local potential. Either way, what's most important is that we understand what graded means. A graded potential simply means that it exists in various sizes. It is specifically not an all or nothing phenomenon. Local potentials or graded potentials come in different sizes. They're not all the same. You can have small ones, you can have large ones, and that depends on the original stimulus strength. If it's a very powerful stimulus, I'll get very large graded potentials. If it's a weak stimulus, I'll get very small graded potentials. And of course, the larger the graded potential is, the more likely it is that it'll be strong enough to trigger a voltage-gated channel in the trigger zone by the time it spreads to the trigger zone. If it starts off as a very weak potential change, then it's going to peter out more than likely before it ever reaches the trigger zone of a neuron. So that implies, as what I just described, implies the second feature of local potentials. They are decremental, meaning the magnitude of the depolarization, how much depolarization occurs, gets weaker the farther away you are from the origination of the local potential, the point of stimulation. All right, and so again, we saw that's because sodium decreases in concentration as it spreads away from the site of origin, and because sodium decreases as it spreads away, the strength of the signal, the strength of the depolarization gets smaller and smaller the farther we spread away. And I just drew a picture of that in the previous slide. They are reversible, meaning that the cell can quickly return to its normal resting potential once stimulation ceases. That's fairly self-explanatory. And then the final feature of local potentials is that they can either be excitatory or inhibitory depending on the signal. So we've pretty much restricted our conversations to this point to excitatory signals, where a dendrite, say, gets stimulated and we get channels opening that allow sodium to flow into the cell. Well, the channels that get opened don't always have to be sodium channels. So for instance, there may be some stimuli that when applied to a dendrite might cause a gated channel to open that allows, instead of sodium to flow into the cell, allows chloride ions to flow into the cell. Well, what's going to happen if the stimulus causes chloride ions to flow into a cell? Well, you're going to inject negative charge into the cell at that point. And so what you're going to do is you're going to take the cell membrane at that region from -70, and you're going to make it, the interior, right, is -70 to start with. You're going to make the interior more negative. You're going to go in the opposite direction of depolarization. This is referred to as hyperpolarization. Hyperpolarization is the opposite of depolarization. Instead of taking the causing the membrane potential to deflect upward towards zero, we take it farther away from zero, making the membrane even more polarized than it was at rest. All right, so this is what hyperpolarization looks like, and hyperpolarization tends to be inhibitory because we need to, as we'll see, we need to depolarize membranes to ultimately lead to an action potential. If we hyperpolarize them, we're making it more difficult to depolarize them enough later to create an action potential. So to make a long story short, hyperpolarization makes it less likely that a neuron will ultimately generate an action potential. All right, less likely to generate an action potential, and so that's an inhibitory effect. All of these features, by the way, of these local potentials are different from action potentials, right? Notice it says unlike action potentials. Action potentials are never graded. Action potentials are all or nothing phenomena. Action potentials do not get weaker as they spread. They are always the same size, and regardless of how far away we are from their origin, they will be the same size from point of origin to the tip of the axon. Action potentials are reversible, but not instantaneously reversible. There is a stereotypical opening and closing of gates that has to be completed before we can stop the action potential. And action potentials are always excitatory. Since they're always the same, we don't have two different versions of them. They are always excitatory. So these are some of the differences between local potentials and action potentials. By the way, these local potentials that we've been talking about are often referred to as postsynaptic potentials. Postsynaptic potentials. And so let's think about why in the nervous system, we call these graded potentials or these local potentials postsynaptic potentials, though they don't always have to be postsynaptic potentials. So let's clarify that a little bit. If I'm a sensory neuron out in the body somewhere with my dendrites, say, out in the skin sensing touch, then this is simply a local potential. But remember, the vast majority of neurons are located inside the central nervous system as interneurons. So what generally stimulates an interneuron? Well, it has to be the axons of another neuron. And so the vast majority of synapses involve one neuron talking to another neuron. And again, usually that's the axon of one neuron releasing a neurotransmitter and stimulating the dendrites of another neuron. Well, what do we call that connection between an axon of one neuron and a target cell? Well, that's called a synapse. Excuse me. So neurons communicate with each other in the central nervous system, for instance, through synapses, just like axon terminals communicate with muscle cells at a synapse. So the neuron with the dendrites that are receiving neurotransmitter from the other neuron's axon, those are referred to as postsynaptic cells. Those are the cells that are on the receiving end of the synapse. The neuron that is releasing the neurotransmitter from its axon to stimulate the second neuron, that is referred to as the presynaptic neuron. So we have presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons. These graded potentials are going to occur on the dendrites of the postsynaptic neurons, and so they are called postsynaptic potentials. And so that's the term you're seeing in Objective 103, postsynaptic potentials. And so, as we just said, these postsynaptic potentials can either be excitatory or inhibitory, depending on what ion the neurotransmitter stimulates. And so the excitatory ones we simply call excitatory postsynaptic potentials. They cause a depolarization, an upward deflection. Ones that cause hyperpolarization, that response is referred to as an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. So an upward change would be an excitatory postsynaptic potential. A downward deflection would be an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. And so these are essentially the two types of responses we can expect to see in terms of local potentials. Now again, this should sound somewhat familiar because we've already talked about postsynaptic potentials back in the muscle system. Remember, the synapse between an axon terminal and a skeletal muscle cell was called a neuromuscular junction. And we said that when acetylcholine diffuses across the synaptic cleft and binds to the acetylcholine receptors in the motor end plate, that caused a graded potential in the motor end plate, and we call that a motor end plate potential. So if you remember that, then you'll recognize that a motor end plate potential is a type of postsynaptic potential. It just happens to be in a muscle cell as opposed to a nerve cell. And because it causes excitation, because it results in depolarization, it is specifically an excitatory postsynaptic potential. So hopefully this is not completely foreign to us. We're just using a new set of terminology to describe a phenomenon that hopefully is somewhat familiar. So again, here we see a diagram of what I was trying to describe, where the dendrites be this a sensory neuron or just a multipolar neuron in the body. This one happens to be a bipolar neuron, just because I think it's easy to draw this way. The dendrites are going to pick up some signal, be it stretch, a chemical, voltage, light, whatever the modality is. We're going to get graded potentials, not just one, usually many graded potentials being created in these dendrites. So you'll have multiple graded potentials, not just a single one. And again, depending on the strength of the signal, they may be very large or they may be very small. Also, depending on how long the signal persists, you may get many of these generated over time. So not just a single one, but maybe 5 per second or 10 per second. Again, depending on the length and frequency of the stimulus. At any rate, all those local potentials, all those postsynaptic potentials or local potentials will start spreading along the dendrites towards the cell body. Remember, as they spread, they weaken. They're going to continue to spread through the cell body, continuing to weaken as they go, and eventually they're going to spread to the trigger zone, where the voltage-gated channels are located. If the sum combined effect of all these local potentials is still big enough at the trigger zone to cause enough depolarization, then at the trigger zone we will generate an action potential. And the action potential then will carry the signal the rest of the way down the axon, ultimately delivering a signal to the target organ of this particular neuron. All right, so hopefully that puts things in perspective in terms of what we've been talking about. All right, now what is an action potential? An action potential, again, is different from local potentials. We already saw that they're all or nothing. They don't weaken as they spread. They really constitute the major type of signal for the nervous system that can travel over large distances. Remember, graded potentials diminish fairly quickly, and so they're only good for spreading the signals maybe about the length of a single cell. But if I need to get a message from, say, the spinal cord to a muscle in my foot, graded potentials aren't going to be up to that job. We need a signal that won't weaken as it spreads. That's the action potential. And so a couple of things to remember about an action potential that we already talked about is, to get an action potential, you must have in the cell membrane voltage-gated channels. You can only get action potentials where you have a high density of voltage-gated channels. So we do have voltage-gated channels in some other parts of the neuron, for instance in the cell body, but we don't have enough to generate functional action potentials. You need a certain density of voltage-gated channels. So where do we find this density, this high density of voltage-gated channels that can produce action potentials? Well, of course, we find those in the trigger zone. We first see these in the trigger zone of the neuron, which is associated with the axon hillock. And in this region, we have a more typical concentration of up to 500 voltage-gated channels per square micrometer of membrane. And so here is where we can first generate action potentials, and that's why this is called the trigger zone. This is where a nerve impulse will be triggered if one is going to take place. Okay, so again, just to reemphasize, we get excitatory local potentials occurring out at the dendrites, say, and they spread, getting weaker as they spread. But if they're still strong enough by the time they reach the trigger zone, it can be enough depolarization to open these voltage-gated channels, and that will initiate an action potential. In terms of what kind of change in action potential is, again, it's all or nothing. It's an all or nothing, very stereotypical kind of change, and it is essentially a spiky depolarization followed by a rapid repolarization. A spiky depolarization followed by a rapid repolarization back down towards resting. And so what happens again is a depolarization from a local or set of local potentials arrives at the trigger zone, at the axon hillock. And again, as we said, if it's strong enough, then the depolarization from the local potentials might create an action potential. So the question is, how strong does it have to be? Well, the depolarization has to be at least at what we call threshold level in order to initiate an action potential. So the question is, what is the threshold potential? Well, the book says here that the threshold that has to be reached is about minus 55. So in other words, at the trigger zone, the membrane potential has to go from resting of about minus 70 to about minus 55. And if you have that much depolarization, by the time you hit the trigger zone, that will be the threshold level that will then open voltage-gated channels. Now, I hedge on this a little bit because in different parts of the body, the resting membrane potential may be a little different. So in other words, it's possible that in some parts of the body, the resting potential of a cell might be minus 90 instead of minus 70. In that case, for a cell whose resting membrane potential is minus 90, the threshold level of depolarization would be about minus 75. So what we see is that this threshold is not a constant minus 55 everywhere. What is generally constant is that the threshold level of depolarization is about 15 millivolts less negative than resting membrane potential. That is the one consistent thing we can say, is that the threshold potential that must be reached to stimulate an action potential is about 15 millivolts less negative than resting. So if resting is minus 70, as we've assumed it's been throughout this discussion, then yes, threshold is going to be about minus 55, because minus 55 is 15 millivolts less negative than minus 70. But again, no guarantee that all neurons in all cells in the body will have a resting potential of minus 70. There is some variation. So the best thing to remember is that it'll be 15 millivolts less negative. So again, if I tell you, or if a source tells you that the resting potential for a particular cell is minus 80, then you can reliably say that threshold for an action potential for that particular cell will be minus 65 in that case, right? 15 millivolts less negative than 80, and so on. Okay, so if threshold, if the local depolarizations, or the depolarizations caused by the local potential change, if they're great enough by the time they spread to the axon hillock to cause threshold levels of depolarization, then we're going to get an action potential. Again, why are we going to get an action potential? Because when we hit threshold, that is enough of a voltage change to stimulate voltage-gated channels. Remember, voltage-gated channels open in response to voltage changes. But you have to have enough voltage change to stimulate it to open. And that's threshold. So if it's still strong enough at threshold, then the first thing that will happen is voltage-gated sodium channels will open. Sodium will enter the cell at that patch of membrane, where the voltage-gated channels have opened, and you will get depolarization. So again, what's going to happen if I was to draw this out Remember, the cell is starting at -70. This is in the axon hillock. It gets a little bit of depolarization from the local potential that's spread from the dendrites, say to -55, which is threshold. I wish this was a straight line. Once it hits that threshold, then we're going to get voltage gated channels opening, and of course sodium enters the cell. That's positive charge entering the cell, and so we're going to get a very rapid spiky depolarization. Notice we get so much sodium entering in this local region where the action potential is occurring that the membrane potential actually, as we said earlier, passes 0 and actually usually levels off somewhere at about +20. So technically we get a depolarization and a reverse polarization, but we just call this a depolarization. Now that in itself is not an action potential. An action potential, again, is a very stereotypical change of depolarization or initial depolarization followed by a very rapid repolarization. When we go back down to resting membrane potential, that's referred to as repolarization. And we're actually going to overshoot it a little bit. That's hyperpolarization. And then we wander up back to where we start at -70. So ultimately, an action potential is always going to look like this: a spiky depolarization, a rapid repolarization, extra polarization called hyperpolarization past -70, and then gradual return to -70. This, and when I say gradual, I'm talking a few milliseconds. Right? This whole thing is happening over the space of just a few milliseconds. So gradually is a relative term here. All right, so what causes that repolarization once we get the initial depolarization? Well, let's see what our objectives in the slide is saying here. As the membrane potential rises above 0, right? Remember we said it was going to go all the way up to +20. The sodium channels begin to become inactivated. And so, again, these are voltage-gated channels, and they are stimulated by voltage in multiple ways. So the initial effect of the depolarization is to cause them to open. But once the voltage change gets too high, the voltage-gated channels in response to that start to close. And so the sodium channels begin to rapidly close, and the voltage peaks out somewhere in the positive range. I said +20. The book is saying +35. I think you'll find different books give different values for this peak level of depolarization. But what happens next is that slow potassium channels will open. And what happens when you open potassium channels? Well, remember, because of the sodium-potassium pump, potassium is always higher on the inside of the cell. So when I open potassium channels, potassium is going to flow out of the cell. And that outward flow of positive charge causes the interior of the cell to become more negative. That's repolarization. These slow potassium channels, by the way, are also voltage-gated channels that are responding to voltage changes. They just have a different threshold than sodium does, and so it takes them longer to begin to open. These potassium channels remain open for some time, giving the membrane enough time to not only return to resting, but to actually shoot past it. And that's what I said on the previous diagram was hyperpolarization. Following hyperpolarization, the normal activities of the cell resume. Sodium and potassium then continue to leak through their passive channels. The sodium-potassium pump continues to work, and again, in a relatively short period of time, everything is restored to normal. So here's a much better drawing than my fairly pathetic drawing was a couple of slides ago. But this is what I was trying to show. So again, just to summarize, we start at rest. This is a patch of membrane in the trigger zone, in the axon hillock. So it's sitting at rest. In comes a local potential that is spread in from dendrites that have been stimulated by some stimulus. regardless of what it is. If those signals are still strong enough by the time they reach the trigger zone to reach threshold levels of depolarization, which again about 15 millivolts less negative than rest, we are going to then initiate the action potential. So technically the action potential starts right here. We get voltage-gated sodium channels opening up, causing a rapid depolarization. Once we pass zero, the voltage-gated sodium channels start to close. So eventually it stops. And shortly after the sodium channels opened, the potassium channels open. They have a higher threshold, remember. And so they have begun to open, and now potassium starts to flow. Which way will potassium flow? It will flow out of the cell due to its concentration gradient. That represents a loss of positive charge from the interior of the cell, and so that starts to bring the membrane potential back down towards negative. And this continues as long as the potassium is flowing out. We actually overshoot resting. This was called hyperpolarization. And then leakage channels in the sodium-potassium pump will gradually return things to normal. All right, so that's a summary of everything we've just talked about. And here we see a different picture of what's going on, associating the activity of the voltage-gated channels with where we are in the action potential. So at rest, these voltage-gated channels are closed. When a wave of a local potential depolarization hits, the first thing that happens is the sodium channels open, allowing sodium to flood into the cell. That's the upward spike. Following that, the sodium channels close, the potassium channels open, allowing potassium then to exit the cell. That starts to bring it back down. And eventually, when we get back around resting or hyperpolarized, then the potassium channel will close. We gradually readjust back to normal, and then we end up back where we started, where both channels are essentially closed. Now, people often ask, does this action potential disrupt the membrane potential of the entire cell? Especially when you consider that usually you don't have just one action potential, you usually have many action potentials happening one after the other in high succession. So do all these action potentials disrupt the membrane potential overall of the cell and eventually lead to deactivation? And the answer is no. And the reason is, there's a couple of reasons why it doesn't disrupt the potential of the entire cell. And that is, first of all, relative to all the ions inside and outside of the cell, only very few ions are involved in a single action potential. And as you see in objective 111, only one ion in a million gets involved in an action potential. So even though we have lots of ions flowing, compared to all the ions that exist, it's only 1 in a million that actually get involved in the action potential. So first of all, it's a relatively small number of ions. And then second of all, action potentials are extremely localized phenomena. They occur in a very tiny, microscopically, submicroscopic patch of membrane. So they're not big in terms of scope. They're not big in terms of scale. They only happen in a very tiny, tiny part of the entire cell membrane. And finally, they're incredibly fast. They happen so quickly that there's really not enough time per action potential to disrupt overall ion balances that much. All right. Finally, just to remind us, they are all or nothing phenomena. They're not graded. And they do not decrease in size as they spread from the trigger zone down the axon. And they are also irreversible, as we said earlier. Once started, they cannot be stopped like graded potentials can be stopped. And so all of these features make them very good as what we call a nerve impulse, right? A signal that's going to travel rapidly through the axon to get from the neuron to its target cell. Here we put a time scale on it. This was our initial diagram of an action potential, so you can see the various elements taking place, but we've actually stretched that out quite a bit. In reality, this is what an action potential would look like. The depolarization, the threshold would be so rapid that you might not even notice it. And then the depolarization and repolarization occur incredibly quickly. And the hyperpolarization is probably the longest part of the action potential. But essentially, the spike portion of the action potential really takes place in about 5 milliseconds. That's 5/1000ths of a second. So incredibly rapid. And then the hyperpolarization part, to readjust, that might take up to 50 milliseconds. And again, 50 milliseconds, 50/1000ths of a second. So for most intents and purposes, it seems instantaneous to us. All right, we're at an hour and 5 minutes, so this is probably a good place to stop for today. Next time we'll pick up and complete our discussion of the action potential by talking about the refractory period, which helps us understand why action potentials only move in a single direction. And from there, we'll move on to a discussion of synapses. Until next time, stay safe and take care.